Some years ago, I was teaching an ethics class, and I gave the students the following scenario to test their mode of ethical reasoning, and in particular, their attraction to a rule based or deontological approach to ethics. So I said, you're visiting a library. The sign on the wall says, do not reshelve books. Well, you take one book off the shelf, you look at it, look at the cover, it's not the book you want, and you slide it back onto the shelf where you just removed it from a moment ago. Is it ethical to do so? All the students said, yeah, of course it is in that case. But one student said, no, that's not ethical because of the rule. The rule must be followed. So I said, okay, but let's say that you have a Master of Library Sciences degree. You yourself are a librarian. You reshelf books every day in your job. Now that you're visiting this library, you remove this one book from the shelf, you are more than capable to ensure it is reshelved correctly. And you do so in this case. Again, the student replied, no, because of the rule. The rule must be followed. So I said, let's up the ante with a different scenario. You are at a park with your spouse having a picnic. Now, your spouse is stung by a wasp, and your spouse has an allergy to wasp stings, and you don't have a pen that you require. So you need to drive your spouse to the hospital as soon as possible before she goes into anaphylactic shock. And if she does, she may very well die before you get to the hospital. The hospital, however, is 5 miles away. Can you exceed the very low 30-mile-per-hour speed limit as you're driving your wife to the hospital to try to save her life? Again, the student said no because of the rule of the speed limit. 30 miles per hour is the maximum allowed, and the rule must be followed. I said, okay, but what if it is a straight road, completely straight road from the park to the hospital? It's on a prairie, a treeless prairie, where you can see traffic coming for miles, and there's no traffic coming. There's no reasonable risk to the life of others on the road by you exceeding the very low 30-mile-per-hour speed limit, and the stakes are so high that your wife might die, and you exceed the speed limit to save your spouse's life. Again, he said no, because of the rule. The rule must be followed. Well, the disturbing thing here is that some people can defend what are profoundly immoral actions under the aegis of following the rules. Now, one might think here the lesson is simply that a rule-based approach to ethics is wrong. Maybe, however, one could argue that the issue wasn't so much that this fellow was following the rules. Rather, the issue was that he was selective in the rules that he was following, that he had a completely wrong, one might even say a perverse prioritization of which rules should be followed. He was prioritizing the rule to follow the speed limit over the rule to protect and save human life. Consider another analogy on that point. Think about the rule, do not lie. I think we can agree that this is a rule that we have a general obligation to follow. We should not lie. But consider this case. Your daughter Ellie is dating an abusive man, and she comes to your house one day terrified. He's threatening to kill me, she says. I need to hide. So she hides in the crawl space under the stairs. And just a minute later, her abusive boyfriend arrives. He pounds on the door. You open the door while your spouse is in the back of the house calling the police. You can see that he's wielding a gun and he looks outraged. Have you seen Ellie? He says. You might think the rule-based approach to ethics just requires you to say yes, or at least not to say no, which would be lying. But that doesn't follow. You see, in a moment like this, you don't simply have one rule to follow, tell the truth. You have many rules that you have to think. How am I going to follow these various different rules in a way that is prioritizing the ones that are most important? And in this case, for example, there's a rule to protect and preserve life, and specifically a rule that you as a parent have and an obligation as a parent to protect your child. And I would certainly think in a case like that, that those rules take priority over the general rule to tell the truth. So the rule might say, in proper perspective, I haven't seen Ellie all day. I've not seen her all week. I have no idea where Ellie is. So here's then the two big questions. How do you figure out what all the ethical rules are that we are obliged to follow? And when there is an apparent conflict between one or more rules, how do you figure out which rules take precedence? Those are not easy questions, but at least we should avoid the trap of thinking that mindlessly following one rule, like the speed limit or the obligation to tell the truth, is sufficient to ensure that you've done the right thing. Okay, that's my general um, reflections on rule following and ethics. I also want to say that we have to apply that in all sorts of specific areas, including making political decisions and voting decisions. I so often hear from conservative Christians who identify themselves as single issue voters. They've identified one particular issue, abortion is probably the one that comes to mind most readily, as the single basis under which they make ethical decisions and voting decisions. And I want to argue that while those are not unimportant, we have, for example, an obligation to protect innocent human life. And that can very well be reasonably applied to taking a general pro-life stance on the issues of abortion. But on this and on so many other what could be single issue voting bases, what we have to do is think we can't simply check out from our ethical obligations to think through complex issues and complex nested obligations rules by choosing one thing we're going to focus on, whether it's the speed limit or telling the truth, protecting fetal life. We have to think rather about all the obligations we have and all the rules we have, and to figure out what is the complex prioritization of them as we make our ethical decisions and our political and voting decisions. And when you do that, I'm going to submit at the very least, it is much more complicated than people typically think when they choose that single issue under which they're going to make voting decisions or ethical decisions.